It looked ridiculous. 24 small tubes arranged in a bristling ring on the bow of a destroyer, each one loaded with a stubby little projectile that weighed 65 pounds. The whole assembly looked less like a weapon of war and more like something a mad gardener had bolted to the front of a warship. Royal Navy officers examined it and had doubts. Experienced captains weren't sure it would amount to much. Some crews called it a gimmick. U-boat commanders heard about it and weren't concerned. By 1942, they had survived everything the Allies could throw at them. Depth charges, aircraft, ramming attempts. They'd worked out the math. The math was in their favor. Both groups were wrong about the weapon. By the end of the war, this strange-looking device had killed more German submarines than almost anything else in the Atlantic. It had broken something in the psychology of every U-boat crew that encountered it. And the men who understood what it was actually doing, down in the water, in the dark, before the explosion started, they knew something none of the people laughing at it in 1942 had figured out yet. Silence wasn't safe anymore. To understand what the Hedgehog changed, you need to understand what came before it, and why U-boat captains had been so confident. The depth charge had been the primary anti-submarine weapon since the First World War. Imagine a metal drum filled with explosives. You roll it off the back of a ship. It sinks. At a preset depth, a pressure-sensitive fuse triggers the charge. A column of water explodes upward, and if the submarine is close enough, the shockwave ruptures the hull or damages the internal systems badly enough to force the boat to surface. Simple in theory, terrifyingly difficult in practice. Here's the fundamental problem that plagued depth charge attacks for most of the war. As a destroyer ran into attack, its sonar could track the submarine up to a certain point. But sonar worked by bouncing sound waves off objects in the water. As the ship closed the last few hundred yards, the submarine disappeared from the sonar screen. It was directly underneath. The geometry made it invisible. That gap between losing contact and releasing depth charges gave the U-boat crew time. Not much time, but enough. Experienced commanders knew exactly when the destroyer's sonar lost them. They could hear it. The sonar pings changed rhythm. Some captains counted the seconds. Then they turned hard, changed depth, varied speed. They were no longer where the depth charges expected them to be. Even when charges exploded nearby, they often didn't kill. When a depth charge explodes, it produces a massive pressure wave that radiates outward. But water dissipates that wave rapidly. A charge had to detonate within maybe 15 to 20 feet to reliably destroy a submarine. Getting that precision without any idea of exact depth, without knowing exactly where the target had moved during those final blind seconds, was extraordinarily difficult. The numbers showed it. Over 5,000 British depth charge attacks during the war produced about 85 confirmed kills. 1 kill for every 60 attacks. A U-boat captain under depth charge attack was not facing good odds against him. He was facing bad odds, but survivable ones. He could ride it out. He could be patient. He could trust the math. Herbert Werner, who survived the war serving on 5 different submarines, and later wrote about it in a memoir called Iron Coffins, described the routine of depth charge attacks. The boat would go deep. The crew would lie still. Men would hold their breath when the sounds of screws grew close overhead. Then the charges would fall. The concussions would ring through the hull. Equipment would rattle. Light bulbs would shatter. Men would be thrown against steel walls. And then, usually, nothing fatal. The destroyer would have to circle back around, reacquire the target, and try again. In the meantime, the submarine was already somewhere else. Werner said the experienced crews called it riding out the storm. They hated it. It was terrifying in a visceral, physical way that words couldn't fully capture, but most of the time, it didn't kill them. The record belongs to U-427, which survived 678 depth charges dropped against it in April 1945. 678. The crew surfaced and surrendered. They were shaken, but alive. That was the world U-boat captains had trained for. That was the threat profile they had calibrated their courage against. They could endure depth charges because they had done it before and survived. The whole service had built its professional identity around that endurance. 2 more things made them confident. First, depth charges had to be set for a specific depth before being rolled off the ship. If the crew guessed wrong, the charge exploded above or below the submarine, uselessly. Every wrong guess was a reprieve. Second, when depth charges exploded, the concussion temporarily deafened the ship's sonar. It could take 15 minutes for the water to settle enough for the equipment to work again. 15 minutes was a long time to slip away. So, U-boat captains understood their situation clearly. They were hunted by a weapon that was difficult to aim, blind at the critical moment, noisy enough to give them a head start, and statistically likely to miss. The math said, endure, survive, escape. The math was about to stop working. The engineers who built the Hedgehog worked in a small department of the British Admiralty nicknamed the Wheezers and Dodgers. It was an unofficial name for the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, a group tasked with coming up with unconventional solutions to the war's most stubborn problems. In 1941, their problem was the blind spot. If you couldn't track a submarine during the final moments of an attack, the attack was always going to be partly a guess. So the solution was to move the attack to a point before the blind spot began. Instead of depth charges rolled off the stern, what if you fired weapons ahead of the ship? Fire them while you still have sonar contact. Fire them far enough forward that the submarine can't escape the pattern in the few seconds between launch and impact. The Hedgehog was their answer. 24 projectiles arranged in a circular launcher, fired in rapid sequence from the bow of a ship. They left the launcher in under 2 seconds. They entered the water in a circular pattern about 130 feet across, roughly 200 yards ahead of the ship. Then they sank, fast. Each projectile reached 200 feet of depth in under 10 seconds. Half a minute took them down to nearly 800 feet. A U-boat had almost no time to respond. But here was the thing that changed everything. The detail that made the Hedgehog not just a different weapon, but a different category of weapon entirely. The projectiles only exploded on contact with something solid. Not at a preset depth, not on a timer, only when they physically struck the hull of a submarine. This meant something obvious. A hit meant a kill. When a Hedgehog projectile struck a submarine, 35 pounds of Torpex explosive detonated directly against the pressure hull. Not nearby, not through water, against the steel itself. No cushion, no dissipation. The shock was catastrophic. Multiple hits meant multiple simultaneous ruptures. In tests and in combat, no submarine was ever confirmed to have survived a confirmed Hedgehog hit. But it also meant something less obvious, and in many ways, more psychologically devastating. A miss made no sound. If the 24 projectiles entered the water and found nothing, they sank silently to the ocean floor. No explosion, no concussion, no temporary blindness for the ship's sonar. The destroyer kept perfect contact. It reloaded in 3 minutes and came around again. And the crew below, listening through their hydrophones, waiting for the rumble they'd learned to associate with depth charges, heard something they had no template for, a series of splashes, then silence. What was that? What just happened? Was it a new weapon? Did something malfunction? Are we about to die, or did they miss? That uncertainty was its own kind of weapon. Testing and early deployment in 1941 and 42 revealed another problem. The crews operating the Hedgehog weren't trained well enough. They didn't trust it. Early success rates of about 5% were barely better than depth charges. Some captains simply didn't use the equipment at all, preferring the familiar depth charges, even with all their limitations. The Royal Navy eventually had to issue a directive ordering captains of ships equipped with Hedgehog to formally explain in writing why they had not used it on an underwater contact. Better training changed everything. By the end of the war, 1 in every 5 Hedgehog attacks resulted in a confirmed kill. For depth charges, the number was fewer than 1 in 80. The Hedgehog was roughly 16 times more lethal per attack. The first confirmed Hedgehog kill came in November 1942. It had taken more than a year to get to that point. After that, as more crews learned to use it and new sonar technology made targeting more precise, the kills came faster. By 1944, it was standard equipment on destroyer escorts and corvettes throughout the Atlantic. And U-boat crews were starting to understand that something fundamental had changed about the threat they faced. February 19th, 1944. North Atlantic, several hundred miles southwest of Ireland. The night before had been dangerous. Commander Hartwig Lux, commanding the Type 7C submarine U-264, had used a contact from a German reconnaissance aircraft to locate a convoy. He'd approached on the surface. An escort picked him up on radar and fired star shells, flooding the night with harsh white light. One of the destroyers was dead astern, closing fast. Lux fired a homing torpedo from the stern tube to buy time. The destroyer stopped dead in the water. The torpedo missed across its bow by less than 30 feet. U-264 Dove. The British destroyer Forester gained sonar contact at 3:25 in the morning. At 4:04, Forrester made its attack run, not with depth charges, with Hedgehog. Lux and his crew heard the sound of the ship overhead. Standard procedure. Brace for depth charges. Count the seconds. Wait for the concussions. Plan the evasive turn. Instead, they heard splashes. Multiple impacts in the water ahead of them. Then nothing. No explosions. No concussions. No rattling equipment. Just a sound they couldn't identify, followed by a silence they couldn't interpret. Had the attack failed? Had something gone wrong with the enemies? Weapons? Or were the projectiles still sinking? The Forrester still had sonar contact. Loads kept maneuvering, trying to slip away, tracking the ship overhead by sound. Shortly before 5 in the morning, contact was lost by Forrester as U-264 worked its way through the convoy. The submarine had survived the encounter, but the night wasn't over. By late morning, the second escort group, under the command of Captain Frederick John "Johnny" Walker, had arrived on the scene. Walker's group had sunk 3 U-boats in a single day just 10 days earlier, in early February. They were, by 1944, among the most experienced and lethal anti-submarine hunters in the Atlantic. At about 10 in the morning, Walker's group regained contact with U-264. What followed was a relentless, hours-long attack. The submarine tried every evasion technique in the doctrine. Deep dives, sharp turns, decoys. Nothing worked. Walker's crew stayed on contact. Depth charges rained down. Around the 4th major attack, U-264 sustained serious damage. Leaking, systems compromised. The boat was dying by inches. At some point in the early afternoon, Lux made the decision no submarine commander made willingly. He ordered the crew to surface. The British sloop Starling opened fire immediately, scoring multiple hits. The crew went over the side. All 52 men aboard were pulled out of the water, frostbitten and shaken, but alive. It was, by the standards of Battle of the Atlantic, an unusually complete outcome. No men lost, every man captured. Hartwig Lux spent the rest of the war as a prisoner in Britain. He was one of the lucky ones. Picture what it was like to be a U-boat crew member in late 1943 or early 1944. Once the Hedgehog was in widespread use, you've been trained to handle depth charges. You know what they sound like. You know the rhythm. You've survived attacks before. You've processed the fear and filed it away into something manageable. The known threat is tolerable because you understand it. Then something different happens. You hear the destroyer's screws. You hear the sonar pings. You wait for the familiar thunder of depth charges. Instead, you hear multiple splashes ahead of the boat, and then nothing. Just the ping of the sonar, still tracking you perfectly. The ship reloads in 3 minutes and comes back around. There's a particular kind of dread reserved for things you don't understand. You can reason yourself into endurance when you know the threat. When you don't know the threat, your imagination fills in the silence. Some crews, after surviving a Hedgehog attack without knowing what it was, convinced themselves the enemy had switched to silent bombs that would detonate later. Others thought it was some kind of lure meant to make them surface. One prisoner interrogation report from this period noted that some crews believed the splashes were markers of some kind designed to help aircraft or other ships home in on the submarine's position. None of these guesses were right, but they shared one feature. The men knew something had happened that wasn't in their training. The psychological burden was different from depth charges in another critical way. Depth charges, when they missed, had given a form of psychological respite. The concussions ended, the water settled, the sonar went quiet for 15 minutes. You had 15 minutes where you knew nothing was happening to you. With Hedgehog, the sonar never stopped. When it missed, the ship kept perfect contact. The crew could hear the screws. They could track the approach by hydrophone. They couldn't lose themselves in the silence because there was no silence. The ship just came back around. Think about what that does to a crew on a 3-week patrol. The watches had been long before. The air had always been bad. 60 men in a steel tube, sharing the atmosphere with diesel engines and battery gases, eating canned food, sleeping in shifts in bunks still warm from the previous occupant. And now, when the hunters found them, there was no 15-minute reprieve. There was just the persistent, patient ping of a sonar that would not be deafened. Herbert Werner, in his account of the later years of the war, described crews that could barely function after extended time submerged under pursuit. The fear was no longer the acute terror of immediate explosions. It was something more like slow suffocation. Batteries running down. Air thickening with carbon dioxide. men moving in slow motion, thinking in slow motion, still afraid to surface. Some commanders had to order men to surface when the batteries and air situation became genuinely life-threatening. The crews didn't want to come up. They'd rather suffocate slowly than face what was waiting above. That was the state the Hedgehog had helped create. A weapon that didn't miss loudly. A weapon that kept its sonar. A weapon that came back around and around and around. The splash and the silence. That was what they feared most. There was another dimension to the psychological effect, one that played out not during attacks, but between them. When a crew returned to base having survived a Hedgehog attack, they had to describe what had happened. They had to file their patrol reports, and the description of the experience, these strange splashes, this silence, this hunter that kept perfect contact even after the attack, filtered through the U-boat community in a way that ordinary depth charge stories never had. Depth charge stories were stories of endurance. You got under, you held on, you were battered but alive. There was a certain grim pride available in those stories. Hedgehog stories had no equivalent pride available. You had heard the splashes and waited to die, and then when you hadn't died, you still didn't know why. The weapon had either missed or malfunctioned or done something else entirely that you couldn't interpret. And the sonar was still on you, and the ship came back around. By late 1943, the prisoner interrogations at British facilities were generating consistent patterns. Men who had survived Hedgehog attacks described a specific category of fear they couldn't quite articulate. They knew about depth charges. They had frameworks for depth charges. What they described was the experience of having their framework removed, of facing a threat that behaved in ways their training hadn't prepared them for. One detailed account from a captured crew member, summarized in British intelligence records, described a patrol where the boat had been attacked by what they later understood was Hedgehog 3 separate times before the escorts lost contact. After each attack, the crew waited for an explosion that didn't come. After the third attack, some of the younger crew members were non-functional, not injured, just unable to perform their duties. The commander had to shake men back into their stations. They were paralyzed by the silence in a way that the thundering of nearby depth charges had never managed. You can endure the known thing. The unknown thing reaches somewhere deeper. By the end of the war, Germany had lost roughly 30,000 submariners, out of approximately 39,000 who served. That's nearly 3 out of 4. 3 out of 4. Think about what that means if you're standing at a German U-boat base in early 1942, watching a crew walk up the gangway to start a patrol. Pick any 4 of them at random. By the time the war ends, 3 will be dead. The math was different at different points in the war. In 1940 and 41, during what the U-boat crews called the happy time, losses were manageable. The convoys were disorganized. The escorts were few and inexperienced. The weapons they carried were imprecise. A U-boat commander could reasonably expect to complete multiple patrols and survive. By 1943, the math had shifted. In May of that year alone, 41 submarines were lost across the Atlantic. Not in one engagement, not in one ambush, just a steady, relentless attrition across the entire theatre. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German submarine fleet, later called it Black May. His surviving captains had other names for it. None of those names were polite. The families waiting at home had no way to know when the math turned against their men. Letters arrived with delays of weeks or months. Some stopped arriving entirely, and no one told you why, not right away. The procedure was a telegram, a formal notification, 2 sentences about duty and sacrifice, 41 telegrams in May 1943. 41 sets of families who had gone to sleep the night before, thinking their men were still alive. There were families in Germany in 1943 and 44 who had 2 sons, or a son and a husband, or a brother and a father in the submarine service. Some of those families received 2 telegrams. Some received them a week apart. Some received the first one and spent months dreading the second, watching the mail, counting days since the last letter. The town of Lorient in France, one of the main U-boat bases, was bombed heavily by Allied aircraft in 1943, precisely because it was a U-boat base. The French civilians who had lived there were evacuated. The infrastructure of the U-boat war, the bunkers, the docks, the supply facilities, was massive. The human infrastructure behind it was something else. The men who lived in those bases between patrols, who ate in the canteens and wrote letters home, who watched their friends go out, and sometimes watched them not come back. Those men carried a mathematics that no official briefing acknowledged. There was a superstition among experienced crews about not watching departing submarines from the dock. If you watched them go, you'd be next. Some crews invented their own rituals. Others became aggressively fatalistic, embracing the statistics as liberation from fear rather than as a source of it. Werner wrote about both types, the men who faced the numbers directly and the men who couldn't bear to look at them. Both types were necessary. A crew needed men who could function regardless. What the numbers didn't capture was this: a crew member who survived multiple patrols increasingly knew men who had not. Each patrol stripped away more of the framework that said survival was normal. The last men still operating in 1944 and 45 were men who had watched the world around them hollow out year by year until they were the exceptions rather than the rule. Dönitz pulled his remaining submarines from the North Atlantic in late May 1943. It was not surrender. He would resume the campaign later with improved weapons and new tactics. But it was an acknowledgement that something had broken. The escorts had gotten better. The aircraft coverage had expanded. And weapons like the Hedgehog meant that even a submerged U-boat was no longer safe. He wrote in his war diary that he was withdrawing temporarily to assess the situation. His crews, in their bunks at the bases in Lorient and Brest and Saint-Nazaire, had perhaps a different assessment. They knew what the numbers meant. Some of them had started counting. U-549 and the Block Island, May 1944. Commander Detlev Krankenhagen knew his boat, U-549, was a good one. A long-range Type 9 C/40, fitted with a snorkel, a retractable tube that allowed the diesel engines to run while submerged, recharging the batteries without surfacing. By 1944, snorkels were giving U-boats a new lease on life, letting them stay submerged for far longer than before. He had a hunter-killer group in his sights, the escort carrier Block Island and her screen of destroyer escorts, working anti-submarine patrols west of the Canary Islands. Block Island was the centerpiece of a team that had been hunting German submarines for months. She was one of the most effective U-boat killers in the Atlantic. At 8:13 in the evening on May 29th, U-549 slipped through the screen. Krankenhagen fired 3 torpedoes at Block Island. 2 hit. 6 sailors on the carrier died in the explosions. Block Island, the only American aircraft carrier sunk in the Atlantic during the entire war, began to sink. Krankenhagen then fired a salvo of homing torpedoes at the destroyer escorts responding. One hit the bar near the stern, crippling her. It was, by any measure, an extraordinarily successful attack. Then, U-549 went deep. Below depth charge range, Krankenhagen likely believed, running silently, waiting for the Americans to give up. The destroyer escort, Eugene Elmore, found him. Elmore was carrying a new sonar system with exceptional range. She had a Hedgehog launcher. Lieutenant Commander G.L. Conkey made his first attack run at 8:13 in the evening. 24 projectiles entered the water. Silence. No explosions, but no loss of sonar contact either. Krankenhagen tried the standard counter. He timed his turn to coincide with what he expected to be the dead period after the attack, the sonar gap he'd been trained to exploit. There was no dead period. Elmore maintained contact. She reloaded. She came back around at 9:13 on the evening. A second salvo of Hedgehog projectiles entered the water and sank toward U-549. 30 seconds later, 3 explosions. Then a fourth, heavier sound. Sonar operators described it as a deep crunching noise. It was, most likely, the sound of U-549's pressure hull collapsing as the boat sank past crush depth. All 57 men aboard were lost. The England in the Pacific, May 1944. The Pacific Theatre saw some of the Hedgehog's most concentrated results in what became one of the most remarkable anti-submarine actions of the entire war. In May 1944, the destroyer escort England was assigned to sweep a line of Japanese submarines that Allied code-breaking had identified. Working with 2 other ships, England made contact with the first submarine on May 19th. She fired her Hedgehog. The submarine was destroyed. She found the next one 2 days later. Fired her Hedgehog. Destroyed. Over the following 11 days, England sank 6 Japanese submarines in total. 6 submarines in 11 days, all with Hedgehog. The kill rate was unprecedented. Japanese intelligence couldn't explain how one ship was finding and destroying their submarines so efficiently. Allied officers couldn't quite believe the combat reports. The Navy Secretary reportedly joked that there would be a new tradition of naming ships after England, always provided she herself didn't sink them all first. The 6 submarines were staffing a scouting line meant to detect Allied fleet movements. All 6 were gone before they reported anything. The operation they were meant to support failed partly because the information never arrived. U-427. What depth charges couldn't do late in the war in April 1945. The Type 7C/41 submarine U-427 survived 678 depth charges dropped against it during a prolonged attack in the North Atlantic. 678. The crew was battered, equipment was damaged, but the submarine held together. Eventually, her attackers ran low on ordnance and broke off the hunt. U-427 surfaced and surrendered. 678 depth charges couldn't kill it. This was the fundamental limitation the depth charge could never overcome. The shockwave attenuated through water. A miss meant nothing, and misses were common. A vessel could expend an entire rack of charges over hours of attack and still fail to kill a carefully handled submarine. The Hedgehog had no such problem. When it hit, it killed. The challenge was only getting the hit. With improved sonar and trained crews, that challenge became progressively more manageable. In the final 16 U-boat sinkings by American destroyers and destroyer escorts in the war, 11 were achieved with Hedgehog or similar forward-throwing weapons. The depth charge had not been replaced, but it had been supplemented by something categorically more lethal. The Buckley and U-66, May 6, 1944. The destroyer escort Buckley had been hunting the veteran submarine U-66, a boat that had spent 3 years in the Atlantic and sunk ships totaling over 200,000 tons of shipping. By 1944, her original captain was gone, lost in an earlier engagement. The new commander brought her into the area west of the Cape Verde Islands on what would be her final patrol. The engagement that followed became one of the stranger close-quarters fights of the Battle of the Atlantic. U-66 surfaced unexpectedly near Buckley, and what started as a Hedgehog attack turned into a ramming and a hand-to-hand melee on the deck as German sailors tried to board the American ship, and American sailors fought them back with everything available, including, according to accounts, coffee mugs. U-66 was eventually sunk. The episode became a minor legend in the destroyer escort community. But the meaningful part, the part that tells you something true about how the war had changed by 1944, is that U-66 was surprised. She surfaced when she didn't intend to. She was responding to a situation she couldn't control. 3 years earlier, U-66 had been a hunter. In May 1944, she was running. The first confirmed Hedgehog kill, November 1942. The weapon had been installed on over 100 ships before it got its first confirmed kill in November 1942. The details of that first kill remain less precisely documented than later actions. The war was still in its middle period, and not every engagement was reconstructed with post-war thoroughness. What the records show clearly is that after that first kill, trained crews began to see results. The improvement was not immediate, and not even. Some crews continued to underperform with the weapon. Some ships' captains remained skeptical, but the trend was clear. In the final accounting, 268 Hedgehog attacks during the war produced 47 confirmed kills. Compared to the depth charge ratio of 1 kill per 60 attacks, this was transformation. One engineer who worked on the weapons development at the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development reportedly asked, after reviewing the first year's data, whether they had simply built something that worked, or had also built something that the crews had finally learned to trust. The answer, he concluded, was both, and they were not easily separable. Allied confidence versus German despair. By the second half of 1943, something had shifted in how both sides talked about the Battle of the Atlantic. Allied escort captains were beginning to approach anti-submarine warfare with something approaching systematic confidence. They had teams like Walker's 2nd Escort Group, who in that same February 1944 patrol sank 6 U-boats in total, one of the highest single patrol kill tallies of the war. Walker himself would sink 20 submarines. before dying of a stroke in 1944. He was 47. The Royal Navy gave him a state funeral in Liverpool Cathedral. Dönitz sent his condolences. Walker's approach to anti-submarine warfare was characteristic of how the Allied escort community had evolved. He developed a method called the creeping attack, where one ship maintained static sonar contact with a submerged submarine, while a second ship came in slowly and quietly to drop depth charges with far greater accuracy. The quiet ship, not running its sonar, not pinging, was invisible to the submarine's hydrophones until it was almost directly overhead. The technique required close coordination and trust between the two crews. It killed submarines that the old single-ship depth charge approach would have missed. The Hedgehog complemented these improved tactics by solving the problem Walker's creeping attack still had, the sonar gap in the final seconds. With Hedgehog, there was no gap. The weapon fired forward while contact was maintained. Both pieces of the puzzle came together in the hands of trained, experienced, confident crews, and the results showed it. Among German crews, the mood was different. Interrogation reports from captured prisoners in 1943 and 1944 consistently noted what British intelligence analysts called a marked reduction in offensive spirit. Crews that had gone out looking for convoys were now going out hoping to avoid being found. The psychological orientation of the entire force had reversed. The reasons were layered. The math had turned. The new weapons were different in ways that were hard to explain to someone who hadn't experienced them. The bases were getting bombed. Boats were going out and not coming back. And the men at the bases could see it happening, patrol by patrol, boat by boat. Some of this came from visible numbers. The men at the bases could count the boats coming back. They knew which patrols had gone out and which had returned. They knew when a friend's boat was overdue. The math was visible, if you looked at it directly. The Hedgehog was part of this change, but it was not the only part. Centimeter wave radar, fitted to aircraft, had stripped away the U-boat's night surface safety. Very long-range aircraft had closed the mid-Atlantic air gap. Escort carriers brought aircraft to waters that had never seen them. High-frequency direction finding, the technology the crews called Huff-Duff, let escort commanders locate a transmitting submarine within minutes. Each of these things had changed the tactical environment. Together, they had changed the whole strategic context. Dönitz was still sending his men out because the war required it. But by late 1943, every commander who boarded a submarine at a French base, who shook hands with the dock crew, who watched his home port shrink in the wake, understood that the odds were no longer calculated the way his training had implied. The patrol orders still said to find and attack enemy shipping. The orders had not changed. The math had changed. On September 20th, 1943, the British sloop Escapade was accompanying Walker's group when it made contact with a U-boat. Escapade fired her Hedgehog. What followed was one of the stranger accidents in the weapon's operational history. One of the projectiles exploded prematurely as it left its launcher. The explosion on the bow of Escapade killed 16 men and injured 9 more. The ship was very nearly destroyed by her own weapon. She managed to take the crippled frigate Lagan in tow and bring both vessels back to Northern Ireland. The accident illustrated something real about the Hedgehog's early service life. It was not a finished, perfected weapon. It was an improvised solution to an urgent problem, built and deployed and improved in the middle of a war. The Wheezers and Dodgers had built it from need, not from the luxury of peacetime development. Some things about it worked better than expected. Some things failed in ways no one had anticipated. But even with accidents like this, even with the training gap in 1942 and early 1943, the overall verdict was clear. 1 in 5 attacks succeeded. That was a number that changed the war. On May 24, 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz issued an order withdrawing his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes. It was the most significant operational decision he made in the entire war. Not because he admitted defeat, he did not, but because he acknowledged that something in the tactical balance had shifted so severely that continuing the campaign as it was constituted would simply be consuming his remaining submarines without commensurate results. 41 submarines lost in May alone. That was nearly a quarter of his operational strength in a single month. Germany was building new boats faster than at any previous point in the war, but not faster than this rate of loss. The math, the same math his captains had trusted for 4 years, no longer worked in their favor. He pulled the boats back to regroup. to fit them with new weapons and improved technology. The German acoustic torpedo, a homing weapon that could target the propeller sounds of escort vessels, was rushed into service. New radar detectors, stronger anti-aircraft armament to fight back against the aircraft. Eventually, more widespread snorkel deployment. The acoustic torpedo had a tactical logic behind it. If escorts had become more dangerous than the convoys themselves, a weapon aimed at the escorts could change the equation, hit the escort, disable it, create confusion, then attack the convoy. The German acoustic torpedo entered service in the fall of 1943 and scored some early successes. The Allies quickly developed a counter, a towed noisemaker that mimicked propeller sounds and drew the homing torpedoes away from the ships. Within weeks of the weapon's debut, the tactical advantage was largely neutralized. This was the rhythm of the final 2 years of the Atlantic campaign. Germany developed something. The Allies countered it. Germany refined it. The Allies adapted again. But the underlying resource imbalance never changed. The Allies had the shipyards, the aircraft factories, and eventually the manpower. Germany was fighting a war of consumption, and it was running out of the one thing that couldn't be replaced: trained, experienced men. Detonate returned his submarines to the Atlantic convoy routes in the fall of 1943. It went badly. The new tactics helped somewhat. Nothing helped enough. The Hedgehog was now standard equipment across the Allied escort fleet. The combination of centimeter wave radar, very long-range aircraft, escort carriers, improved sonar, and forward-throwing weapons had created a hostile environment that no tactical adjustment could fully overcome. By early 1944, Detonate knew the campaign had failed in its strategic objective. He continued sending submarines out because a withdrawal would constitute an admission and because the Navy's role in the war required it. But the men in his command were dying without corresponding results. In his post-war memoir, he wrote that he continued the campaign as a way of holding down Allied anti-submarine forces that would otherwise be deployed elsewhere. It was, by that point, a rationalization. A way of giving meaning to losses that had accumulated past any strategic justification. In April 1945, with Germany collapsing on every front, he ordered his remaining operational submarines to sail for the American coast on a last harassment campaign. The boats that went out in those final weeks were commanded almost entirely by very young men. Most of the experienced captains were dead. Some had survived to command flotillas ashore. A handful, like Herbert Werner, were still at sea. Werner was one of roughly 24 U-boat commanders still alive at the German surrender, out of the hundreds who had commanded boats during the war. U-853 is still down there, about 40 meters, 7 miles east of Block Island, Rhode Island. Divers visit it regularly. It's one of the more popular dive sites in southern New England. The hull is intact enough to be recognizable. The pressure hull shows 2 blast holes where the Hedgehog projectiles struck in the early morning of May 6, 1945, one forward of the conning tower, one in the starboard engine room. Germany had already lost the war. Hitler had been dead for 6 days. Detonate had ordered all his remaining submarines to return home. Whether Commander Helmut Fromsdorf never received the message or received it and ignored it, no one knows. What's documented is that on May 5th, 1945, 3 days before the official German surrender, he torpedoed an American coal ship off the coast of Rhode Island. 12 men died on that ship. American warships found U-853 within hours. They hunted her for 17 hours. They fired 264 Hedgehog projectiles and 95 depth charges. U-853 tried to flee, then tried to lie still. Both times, the sonar found her. Toward the end of the hunt, American sailors monitoring the hydrophones reported a strange sound rising from the wreck on the ocean floor. A rhythmic hammering on metal, methodical, repetitive. Someone was still alive down there, and they were trying to be heard. The ships kept dropping charges. 55 men were aboard U-853 on May 5th, 1945. All 55 are still down there. They've been there for 80 years. Recreational divers pass through the compartments. The wreck is a war grave, but an accessible one in relatively shallow water. People bring photographs out. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, 2 days after U-853 went down. Fromsdorf was 24 years old.